Um, we're studying in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4. I want to just read over verses 14 through 16 and then get into our study because it all goes together. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but our high priest was in all points tempted as you and I are, yet he didn't sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace with all confidence, that we not braggadocious, not because we're better than others, not because we deserve to be bold, but because we are bold, given who our high priest is. Let us therefore come boldly on that account to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy, and we may find grace to help in time of need. Obviously, mercy and grace are both conditional in that statement. We may find help, we may not. That's going to depend on our relationship with the Lord, of course. The reason I emphasize that, many people argue today that grace is not conditional, grace and mercy, and it is conditional. The ideal of universalism isn't true. That's the idea that all people are going to be saved by grace, ultimately. The way the theory goes with some, and there's all kinds of theories, so you can't nail one down, but there is probably the most extreme theory where you may be, let's say, unfit to go to heaven when you die, and you may go to a type of a purgatory, a place of some type of punishment, not like the hell of fire, but some type of punishment, some type of suffering, where you'll have to exist until you've lived out the correct amount of time according to the Lord. And then when that time is up, you'll be allowed to go into heaven. Ultimately, everybody's going to go to heaven, according to the theory. And that's not true. Unconditional grace, unconditional mercy is what that is. Calvinism is what it is, but it's not true. There's various degrees of it in Protestant denominationalism, but ultimately it's just not the case. And the author points it out right here that we may and we may not. May means there's the possibility of it. And then again, it may not. It depends on our relationship with the Lord. Anyway, with that said, let's move on to the next section, chapter 5. The design of the priest. I should have drawn diagrams, and I didn't. I wished I had of. Design of the priesthood, qualifications of those who administer in the high priest's office. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men and things pertaining to God, they may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. The high priest, you recall, began with Aaron, the brother of Moses. He was the first high priest. Israel was given a priesthood. The priest, of course, would come out of the tribe of Levi. There's various levels of people. Everybody wasn't a priest, but Levites, they served in various capacities in that arena, having to do with sacrifice or representation of the people to God. And then there were the priests who actually worked in the temple. And then, of course, there was the high priest. He was appointed by the Lord. And he was the person who would offer up blood for the sins of the people one time a year. He was called the high priest. He was the only person that was allowed to go into the most holy place. And that, of course, is where God dwelt. In the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, you had the holy place, and then you had the most holy place. Holy place was twice as big as the most holy place. Now, it wasn't that big. No. I believe it was 30 by 60, and then the most holy place was 30 by 30. I believe that's correct. Anyway, between the two compartments in this big old tent, there was a veil or a big curtain that hung up and separated the two compartments at the 60-foot line. It separated the holy place from the most holy place. And the only person that could pass through the veil was the high priest. And these things are all very important because they were a shadow of what ultimately would come through the Lord Jesus Christ. He was going to be the true high priest one day. But the high priests that were appointed initially, these were to get the people accustomed to the true high priest and priesthood when it came. They would understand everything because they've been doing it all their life. They were very familiar with it. And this is what our author's talking about. So it's good to have some knowledge about the priesthood at that time. But what he does, he points out a few characteristics that the high priest had to possess. And the reason he wants to point them out is because Jesus was the embodiment of all those qualifications. Okay? And that's what we'll see here. Every high priest is taken from among men. The high priest had to be a human being. And he'll explain the reasons for that. But the high priest had to be a man. That's one of the reasons why Jesus had to become human, in human form. In order for him to be a high priest, he had to be taken from among men. He had to wear flesh. So he became a man that he might serve in the capacity of a high priest. Every high priest is taken from among men. Why? They're appointed for men, from among men and for men. The reason is pretty obvious. The high priest can have compassion on fellow human beings because he knows what it's like to attempt to live a sinless life. He understands that. He's taken from among men, appointed for men, in things pertaining to God, service to God. Why? That he may offer first gifts and secondly sacrifice for sin. That's why the high priest was appointed, taken from among men in service to men in things pertaining to God, and it would be his responsibility to offer the gifts and the sacrifices. He was the only one that could do that, was the high priest. He can have compassion. Being a man, he understands. He knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows how hard it can be to resist temptation. He's lived through it. He's given into it. He's sinned himself, the high priest. He's not a perfect man. He knows. And when you have a problem with sin, and you go to the high priest and you try to explain what happened, he understands what you're talking about because he lived through it himself. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant, perhaps of law, or going astray, starting to live in sin. I don't know how honest we are about temptation. Temptation's it's worse than the itch. You try to You try to deal with it. You try to overcome it. And sometimes it seems incredible to you that it could happen, but you find yourself living in sin. You not only gave in to the temptation, but you continued in it because it felt so good. And it seems incredible that we could do that. It seems incredible to ourselves that we can do that. And when we come to ourselves and we're finally sorry for what we've done, we need forgiveness. Where do you turn in a case like that? Who's going to understand? Well, the high priest would understand because he's a man just like you are. He's been tempted too. He got caught up in sin. And you can talk to him about it. And he could try to help you understand what happened to you and the fact that you can be cleaned of sin and start again. It's important for the high priest to be a man of compassion. And this is his work. He can have compassion because he himself is also subject to weakness. He's done the same thing. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, number one, so also for himself, number two. He's required to do something for the people first, and then for himself second. Well, what is it? To offer sacrifice for sin. That's his responsibilities. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. He was picked by God to be the high priest. Now he mentions his requirement to offer for the people and also to offer for himself. You've likely heard me talk about this before, probably several times. On the Day of Atonement, one day a year, the high priest would go to the altar and he would retrieve blood from the sacrificed animal, and he would carry it through the holy place, through the veil, into the most holy place, and he would scatter the blood over the mercy seat where God sat. He offered up blood for himself because he was guilty of sin. And it was necessary for him to be cleaned of his sins. So he went in the first time. He'd go back out to the altar. He'd retrieve another bowl of blood, back through the holy place, back through the veil, and back into the most holy place, and he would scatter the blood again, this time offering a blood sacrifice for the sins of the people. First, he had to offer blood to clean himself. Secondly, he had to offer blood in order to clean the people. One day a year, he went into the holy place, and he went in on that day 2 times. And he was the only person that was allowed to do that. And this he did. Now, why did he do it? Well, it was all in anticipation of what Jesus was going to do one day. We read about Jesus passing through the veil. Why? He's the high priest. He has to pass through to offer his blood. Unlike the human high priest, though, Jesus only passed through the veil one time. Well, it's appointed unto men once to die. Well, that's true. But the reason he only passed through one time was because he didn't have to offer blood for himself. When he carried his blood into the throne of God, he offered his own blood on behalf of the people because he was sinless. So he didn't have to go twice like the high priest. That was the difference. Is there any questions over that? Now I say that because a lot of places brings that up in Hebrews, Galatians. I think the Revelation talks about it some too. This is something the Jews, of course, are very familiar with, and we want to be familiar with it too, so we can understand what our authors are talking about when they address the matter. Okay, that brings us to number 3, qualifications of Christ to officiate as our high priest. It sounds kind of silly to say that Jesus had to be qualified, but he did. He had to meet certain criteria in order to be qualified to offer up blood. And then there's further encouragement to believe and obey the Lord, verses 5 through 10. So, also, Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." The high priest was chosen by God. And this is what our author is saying. Jesus didn't ordain himself to be the high priest. That was done by the Father. The Father ordained him. He didn't self-appoint himself. He was given the job. It's not as though he stole the power or whatever. It was thrust upon him by his Father. As he also says in another place, this is from Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." I've often wondered how confused Bible students were when they read passages like this. To me, I don't know how it would have made any sense to them because it seemed so out of joint. I'd say there was a lot of debates that took place, a lot of people doubting the authenticity of the passages and things, but our author's using it again now in the New Testament. He was ordained to be high priest, but the Lord ordained him to be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, not according to the Levitical system. And that's what would have thrown everyone. They would have thought naturally he'll be a high priest according to the priesthood of Aaron. They would have assumed that Jesus would have come out of the tribe of Levi and follow in the footsteps of Aaron. But that wasn't the plan at all. He was going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Well, who's Melchizedek? He's the man that pops in on the Bible stage for about 12 and a half seconds. I mean, he's in, he's out, it's over. That's all you know about Melchizedek. But we're going to know a little bit more directly. And to have been an Israelite and try to understand that, it would have blown my mind if I tried to figure it out. You wouldn't never figured it out, but it would have been fun trying. Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him, who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. That, of course, is the Lord Jesus. He was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, and at his death, he lamented long and hard. Though he was a son, even though Jesus was the Son of God, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. He learned obedience. What does that mean? Did he learn how to obey God? No, that's not what that means. He learned the cost of obedience. He lived through the price of loyalty to God. It was a very heavy price that a person had to pay. And Jesus, he lived through that. He lived through the sadness of seeing so many Israelites who were not following the Lord. And I've often wondered if this wasn't the worst pain that Jesus suffered. It's always been the one that's bothered me most. I don't believe that means it bothered him most too. But the suffering of losing some of the congregation is breathtaking. It's very hard on a shepherd. Not only because it's the shepherd's responsibility not to let that happen, but also because of love for the person that's drifting and your inability to persuade them not to slide away. It's very hard. And if it was hard for me, I could imagine how hard it would have been on our Lord. I recall when he was coming down the Mount of Olives, and he came around the mountain at one juncture, and when he did, all Jerusalem just opened up before him. I've been there before. You see the whole city from where you're at. And Jesus, when he got to that point, and he looked out over the city, he broke down and began to cry. And the reason was, when he looked down on the city, he knew what their fate was going to be. Boy, that's a problem he had to live with that we don't. He knew the future. He knew that most of them were going to lose their souls. And there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't stop it. He tried to stop it, but he couldn't stop it because they weren't going to listen to him. And with all that knowledge, it took his breath, and he cried out loud in front of all the people that were with him. They didn't know what was going on, but he did. I've often wondered if this wasn't the greatest pain he suffered. Not just that one time, but all the time. Throughout his ministry, he would look out over the crowds, and he knew. He knew the fate of the many. And he loved them so much. And he had to live with all that weight. It had to be breathtaking, horrible. He learned the price of obedience. He learned the cost of faithfulness. He knows how hard it is for us to say no. Now, that doesn't mean he'll excuse us when we sin, but he knows how hard it is, and he can have compassion. Even though he's God and has no faults at all, he can have compassion on me and on you because he knows. He knows. And that's good for us. And having been perfected, having come to all this knowledge, this understanding, having fulfilled all the requirements of Messiah, he became the author of eternal salvation. Everything hung on him. For all who obey him, That's so important there. We all know that today obedience is not seen as being a very important thing anymore. People just kind of push it aside. It's all about faith. If you believe, everything's going to be well. And that's not true. It's just not true. He became the author of eternal salvation. He has the capacity to save a person from their sins, those who will obey him. Now, obedience implies faith. And faith, biblical faith, implies obedience. Remember last week, we've seen how the terms were used synonymously. Faithfulness and obedience were used interchangeably, both of them meaning the same thing, which led to salvation. And how sad it is that today we look out over the world today and we see a world full of people who don't believe it's necessary to obey the Son of God. Oh, I believe that he's the Son of God, and that's enough to get me saved. That's not true. That's just not true. And so many people believe it is true, and it's heartbreaking. And you try to talk, and you don't get very far very often. He was called by God to be our high priest, again, according to the order of Melchizedek. There's a similarity between Jesus and Melchizedek. And the Lord arranged for this to happen a long time ago, 2,000 years earlier, actually. The Lord arranged for an encounter between this man Melchizedek and Abraham, the father of the Israelites. They had a brief encounter, and the encounter presented to the world a type of Messiah. There's characteristics between him and Jesus that are very similar. That brings us now to section 5, chapter 5:11 through 6:20. Admonition to the Hebrews due to their failure to diligently study God's word. They weren't going to obey God anyway, so they had no reason to study, and they didn't. They just put all of it on the back burner. Their life with God was, casual, I guess you'd say. They gave it little thought. They just got up and they lived, and they didn't do bad stuff, I reckon. They probably said, I'm not going to murder anybody today. I'm not going to rob a bank, or I'm not going to steal somebody's camel. I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that. That's the way a lot of religion is, really. That's the way we're inclined to think of all the things we're not going to do. That's wrong. I'm not going to commit adultery because I know that's wrong. I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to lie, at least try not to lie. I'm not going to be involved with drinking or drugs. I'm gonna stay away from all that stuff, and I'll be a good, faithful child of God. Is that correct, reckon? The problem with our thinking, and it was my thinking for a long time till I learned better. The problem with our thinking is that we're focusing on the bad things that we do not do, and that's good. But at the same time, we give little attention to the good things that we do not do. And I know it's significant that every judgment parable in the New Testament, and there's a lot of them, the parable where we see the judgment scene of God. Every judgment parable where people are rejected by the Lord, it's not because of what they did that was bad, but because of what they did not do that was good. And I think that should be maybe a warning to us. The thing we need to watch out for mostly, it's not the bad stuff. We're not going to do it. You're not going to murder anybody. You're not going to rob a bank. You're not going to do that stuff. But are you going to love your neighbor as yourself? Are you going to put the Lord Jesus Christ first, foremost in your life? Are you going to reach out and help someone who needs help when the opportunity presents itself? What about all the good things? It's good not to do bad things, but it's better to do good things. Most of us, we don't do bad things because we don't want to. Whether I was a Christian or not, I don't want to go around murdering people. I don't want to rob banks. I'd rather just get me a job and live my life and leave me alone. I don't want to go to prison or anything like that. You don't have to be a Christian not want to do that stuff. It's kind of normal for most people. But when it comes to doing the good stuff, I believe we have to be born again. I think we have to become a new creature. I think we have to take on the qualities of the Son of God. That's where you become more important to me than I am to myself. You know, a man told me years ago that when he got out of college, he meant to go to the Peace Corps and spend 2 years in the Peace Corps. And he didn't do it. He got married and had to get a job and all that. And I said, what in the world made you want to go to the Peace Corps? You know, you don't make any money. All you do is work all the time. And when it's done, you don't have much left over. And he said, in order to give, I give what? You know, give back for the blessings I've received. And I thought, boy, that's a weird concept. I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I thought, boy, that's a weird concept. Since then, I've learned that the greatest joy a human being can experience is to put other people before yourself. The greatest joy you ever have is when you make sacrifice for somebody else. And you know it's true. It's Christmas time, and what gives you the most joy? The gift you get or the gift you give? We got all these rugrats running around that's got more toys than Donald Trump. And we'll go out and buy them something that costs half an arm. And boy, we wait on Christmas, we wait, we watch. Because when they get there, they're going to sit, they're going to get excited, and we want them to scream and jump and run and be happy. And if they do that, man, we are tickled to death. Best feeling we had in a month. is to make our grandkid or our kids happy. Why? Because it's better to give than to receive. We live it out. Jesus said it, but we live it out regularly. And when you stop and you boil everything down, what's most important to you is not what you get, but what you're able to give. Because that's what love does. Love gives. That's why God gave his only begotten Son. Love gives. It doesn't take. And when we learn and we become like God and we give because it's so good to do, then we get to taste heaven. Even though we're living in the earth, we get a taste of heaven and how sweet it is. The Hebrews hadn't learned that lesson yet. And they're fixing to be schooled in the matter. And it's going to be sharp, it's going to be painful, but they got to hear it because time's short. So we got a few minutes yet. Oh, 3. We'll get somewhere in 3, won't we, Jerry? Let's go. Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say. Man, it's hard to explain. I can understand that. Since you have become dull of hearing. Whoops. I can't explain that. I got a lot to say about Melchizedek, he says, but I don't know how to teach you because you become dull of hearing. They weren't always dull of hearing. There was a time, apparently, when their ears were perked up. They hadn't been Christians too long. I don't know, 15 years? They hadn't been Christians too long. And there was a time when their ears popped open whenever somebody started speaking divine revelation. But he says, since that time, you become dull. You're not eager to hear. You're not eager to learn. That excitement that you once experienced is not there anymore. Now you're just getting by, with what you got, what you know. And I don't know how to tell you about Melchizedek. Because in order to understand what I'm going to say, you got to have your ears turned on. You got to listen, pay attention. For though by this time you ought to be teachers. Notice there comes a time when we ought to be a teacher. Now, he's not saying we'll necessarily teach, because all people don't need to be teaching. All people aren't qualified to teach. Some people teach and they make people angry, needlessly. And they don't need to be a teacher. But even though we may not be qualified to be a teacher, we get to a point where we should be qualified to teach. We may not do it, but we should know enough that we could. And that's what he's saying. Enough time has elapsed where you ought to be able to teach the gospel, and yet you can't do it. You don't have the knowledge to do it. It's not the ability, it's the knowledge. You don't have it. You need someone to teach you again, all over again, the first principles of the oracles of God. The ABCs of Christianity. You ought to be able to teach other people, but now here you are at a juncture where you need to be taught the ABCs all over again. because you've lost them. The elementary principles of Christianity are essential to know in order to build on those principles. You got to have a foundation before you construct the house. If you don't understand, let's say, the Old Testament, if you don't have a working understanding of the Old Testament, and some preacher comes along and he starts preaching from the book of Romans, how can you understand what he says? Or what if he preaches from Galatians? Or maybe from the book of Hebrews? How can you understand what he's saying? Because he's using Old Testament analogies in order to make his points. How do you understand? The book of Revelation, how would you understand? So much of it is founded in the Old Testament scriptures. There would be no understanding. And this is what he's saying here. You need to go back all over again and learn the first principles. Learn the foundational things. Learn why Israel existed as a nation. Learn why Israel was called the house of God. Learn why there was a priesthood, why there was a tabernacle. Know why there's a connection between these Old Testament types and New Testament antitypes. The first principles, learn them, and then you're ready to build the house. And we're going to have to quit because everybody's